All right, ladies and gentlemen, guess what? I have just been broadcasting for the last half hour, and I'm going to have to tweet about this right now. I forgot to click the start broadcast button. Okay, so let me go to Twitter. Yeah. Wow, that is just crazy. You know, that I don't know. I don't know what to say about what the hell I did. Yeah. So just let me let me do a little tweet about this. I've been talking for half an hour on YouTube. Did not realize that I had not started my broadcast. All right. I'll just have to do a little LOL because I'm okay. Let's see. Okay. So please bear with me. Yeah. That was bad. So sorry. Okay. So, anyways, I'm going to say what I said all over again because I'm hoping to see people come into the channel, but okay. Yeah. Anyways, I'm hoping to see people come into the channel, but whatever. I will say what I said before, and I want to talk about the impulse to judge and the impulse to censor. And what's brought this up for me is Howard Chaykin. The cover for his upcoming comic, Divided States of America, #4, depicts a Pakistani man who's been lynched, and the depiction is graphic. If you go looking it up, it's definitely not safe for work, and you will likely find it disturbing. And I have to admit something right now that probably like everybody else, I judge works of art sometimes on a moral level. I look at something and I say, I find that offensive. Like for example, comics often over sexualize teenage girls, and by the way, rock and roll songs do this too. You can start looking some of the famous rock and roll songs that are about underage girls, and you're like, how do people get away with singing about this? And comic artists sometimes to me seem like they're stuck at the age, like it seems like they're stuck in an adolescent age, where like maybe when they first learn how to draw, that's about the last time they learned about women, and then they draw these women who are often like not just unrealistically proportioned, but like impossibly proportioned, uh, just there, just there as sex objects and underage. And I'll look at that just for example and say, well, isn't that bad? All right. Um, and it's not just and it's not just the big publishers doing this, you know. Um, but there is pressure from the market to create these depictions, and so like you know I've had that judgmental impulse of that's not good, that's a bad thing, you know. I've never joined a boycott over that. I've never said I'm not going to buy DC Comics anymore because they drew a 17-year-old girl, like a stripper. And to be clear, it's not even a lack of clothing, because you take a look at a character like Wonder Woman, and you know, um, and she and the Amazons are often scantily clad, but they're there to kick ass and protect the world and that kind of thing. Um, um, it's when the clear purpose of a character is you know um, is to look at my look at my tits. I'm supposed to be a kick-ass character, but really I'm just there to be ogled at. You know, um, and if that were the purpose of the entire comic and everybody was there for that, basically if it's a sex comic, well, that's one thing. You know, but when they do this to characters who are supposed to be powerful and who are underage, yeah, it gets a little creepy and disturbing. So there is my, like, I understand the impulse when somebody looks at that cover of Chakins to say, like what the hell did this guy do? I don't feel it for that particular image, but I understand why somebody would. But a few years ago, I took a step back from just automatically condemning that impulse, and just automatically condemning that kind of work. And the reason that I took a step back, the reason that I took a step back is that often censorship is more, often censorship is just worse than whatever it attempts to censor. So let's consider different kinds of censorship. One kind of censorship, perhaps the least objectionable, is when somebody or some group, who controls a press or some other means of communication says ahead of time, don't do this and don't do that. Like if you sell your television show to NBC, there's going to be a whole list of things you can't do. From certain curse words to nudity to some certain acts of violence. There's going to be stuff that NBC is just going to tell you ahead of time. You can't do this. So that's one kind of censorship. To me, it's the least objectionable, but it can still be objectionable. And a big difference for me is how big is the venue that is being censored, and how necessary is a censorship to the proper function of that venue. So I don't think that, like as big as like NBC is, for example, its censorship meant a lot more when we didn't have cable, when we didn't have Netflix and Hulu, and HBO. Now there's multiple venues, and so the censorship of the major networks is really no big deal. Now, before cable was big, before cable was producing its own shows, it meant that there's a lot of stuff that could not be done on television, and I think that's bad, yeah. But because the entire field is now so diverse, the censorship of even a large party doesn't stop an artist from producing something, Okay. And similarly, there's another kind of censorship where, you've got your show for NBC, and then after the fact, after you've submitted the show, they tell you, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't do this." Again, it's their venue, and the more robust and diverse, something is, a particular industry is, the less that kind of censorship matters. But post-fact censorship is still worse than censorship which you know of ahead of time. So for example, if you're if you have a comedy show and you mock the president too strongly, and NBC tells you after you've done the show, after you've already essentially been hired by them or sold your show to them, if they tell you sorry, we can't do the 5th episode, no, and you're like, wait, your standards and practices people didn't complain. That long list of stuff you gave us didn't say anything about insulting the president, and NBC might come back and say, yeah, but he might tweet something mean about us, and we don't want that. We don't want to be in the receiving end of that. So chill with that. Just do another episode 5. And or just reshoot that. Just reshoot that part. That post-fact censorship is worse. It can create a chilling effect for whoever works at that network, or whoever sells to that publisher, and again, the smaller the venue, or the more robust the industry is, the less that matters, and finally we have censorship as a result of economic threats such as boycotts and embarrassing the company. And this is one of the worst forms of censorship. It is censorship. When censorship does not, some people say that censorship requires the government. Oh, if the government doesn't do it, it's not censorship. That's true with the First Amendment. The First Amendment does, the guarantee of freedom of speech is meant to restrain the government. But the philosophical underpinnings of that First Amendment, those go back to, like the idea of freedom of speech is not just, freedom of speech from the government's censorship. It's freedom of speech from anybody's censorship. To give you another example, the Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. But let's say that an employer goes into your desk and confiscates your diary, for no, and then they tell you, no, we don't have to explain it. Go to hell. You know, or let's say you're a kid and you're 12 years old and your mom discovers your diary. Guess what? In those cases, you'll still feel, and rightly so, that you've been subjected to an unreasonable search and seizure. Somebody took my stuff and looked at it without permission. Or maybe your spouse breaks into your phone and looks at your text messages and realizes that you've been doing nothing wrong, but they still did it. That's still an unreasonable invasion of privacy. Just because the government didn't do it, it's true the Fourth Amendment won't protect you from your husband or wife, looking at your text messages. That's between you and your spouse, but your privacy has still been violated. And so if you're an artist and a bunch of people call your boss and tell him that that you are expressing terrible ideas that they don't ever want to see again, and they won't buy his products, et cetera, yeah, you're still attempting to censor that artist. And that censorship, is so wrong. There's all. Maybe one of you can tell me of something good that's come of it once. I don't know. I can't think of anything right now. So back to Howard Chaykin's cover, where Image Comics was on the receiving end of censorship, of threats of a boycott. And the point, and so that means that Howard Chaykin was on the receiving end of that too, and the dark side of this, it's a couple things. One, Chaykin, well, certainly Image Comics, doesn't want to go out of business. It doesn't want this to spiral out of control, and you never know when some social media thing is going to spiral out of control. And God knows that we love to sit in judgment. So how tempting would it be if you haven't heard of this and you see this image from Chaykin to share it and type something in the comments like, shameful, share, how can people be allowed to draw this? Share, how tempting is it to do that? I've given into that temptation. I told you, I had to rethink this stuff, because it isn't just one image, like if it were possible to go back in time, assuming that you're offended by Chaykin's image so much, and say to Chaykin, please, for God's sakes, this is an offensive image. Please just take it down, and just limit it to him. You have a little conversation with him, and maybe, but that's not how it works. You don't go back in time. You don't limit it to one dude. The closest to that is an editor who would say to, Howard, are you sure, about this image? Maybe you should try something else. People will misunderstand it and feel bad about it, and and even depending where that comes from, that can be a little censorious. But at least it's only between the editor and the artist, and ultimately, if the editor is part of the creative process, which a good editor is, then really it's part of the artistic process to consider the audience and how they'll react to it. So when the audience becomes this angry thing, and by the way, a small part of the audience becomes this vocal angry thing, and that audience, and the audience bullies the publisher. That's what it is. We're threatening to put you out of business if you don't take this down. That's I don't know what else you call that but bullying. Yeah. So what this does is that it creates an environment in which artists and writers and musicians and anybody who's artistic thinks twice about what they do. Now, maybe if you have a censorious impulse, you think to yourself, well, good, maybe people shouldn't be depicting somebody who's been lynched. That's terrible, but then think about the song "Strange Fruit." So suppose that back in, was it the 20s or 30s when that song was first released. So suppose around that time, some men's magazine had this cover of this person being lynched, and back then the controversy might have been a little different. The controversy might have been that Chaikin, by the way, is against the lynching, just in case you're curious. So maybe that would have been the controversy, how can we criticize our brothers in the South for defending the honor of their women, against these rapacious Negroes, so maybe that would have been the controversy, as opposed to, wow, that's that cover depicts a hate crime, but you could imagine something like that, and so Strange Fruit itself, might have been subject either to censorship from people still angry about this Chaikin cover, or let's look at a more recent example, Beyonce song, if I remember correctly, Formation, the one where she goes to the Super Bowl and has black liberation stuff, and there was also a censorious impulse there, coming from the right this time instead of coming from the left. Well, look, Chaikin and Beyonce can both survive. Chaikin's had a long career. Beyonce's, it's one of the most powerful women in entertainment. So they can both survive these criticisms. But this censorious impulse does destroy some careers. Look at Colin Kaepernick. People offended by what they see as his lack of patriotism, and I'll argue with them, forever about that. I think they're so wrong. But they've complained to teams that even would consider hiring him, and and maybe the owners feel the same way, but definitely they've heard from their fans, and their fans have essentially censored him. The censorious impulse hits a lot of people, but it's not just the person it's aimed at. It's not just Chaikin. It's not just Kaepernick. It's not just whoever says the bad thing or the wrong thing at this moment and gets the attention of social media. It's everybody who's creating something or who's speaking out in some way. When people were, and I guess we still are, so judgmental against drugs, John Denver, mild-mannered John Denver, was censored in some places for the song Rocky Mountain High. Can you believe that? Which, spoiler alert, is not about drugs. It's literally about enjoying nature, getting high from nature. There is there is an effect. It's called a chilling effect for a reason. You know, I felt it. I felt that chilling effect. You know, um, I I write about horror and the human condition. You know, the and and so when you put together scary, creepy, terrible things with people's real pain, um, you know, I'm feeling almost certain that one day somebody's going to try to censor me, and the more I see other people censored, the more sure I am of that. You know, and while I can't be said to have a career right now, um, I'm basically just starting. I wonder one day if I'm going to write the wrong thing, and then I'm going to be uh, on the receiving end of some censorship, you know, and will that be strong enough to keep, you know, to keep me from making a career of what I love doing? You know, I hope not. You know, and I'm not gonna let that stop me. You know, but you know, but it is a concern, and it's something that I think artists shouldn't have to worry about. You know, um, you know, art is transgressive a lot of the times. You know, it's not just that artists make mistakes; they do, but artists also, um, you know, art comes from a very individual place inside you. You know, and sometimes you are giving voice to terrible impulses, bad ideas. You know, um, you know, truth in art is often a really messy thing. You know, sometimes you're like Howard Chaykin, and you do that image poorly. I don't mean in terms of composition, but just in terms of even the idea to have it. You know, even the idea to present it in the way that he did, maybe there was something, you know, maybe it was just poorly executed. Um, but an artist has to be free to engage controversial subjects, even when they're poorly executed. You know, um, you know, because really the one you can't let, like, the you can't say, well, the difference between Strange Fruit, the song, and Chaykin's cover is that Strange Fruit is beautiful and sensitive, you know, and Howard Chaykin's cover is garish and grotesque, you know. Um, but the censors typically look not at how beautiful something is, but even that shouldn't be a dividing line. But they just look at the subject. You know, um, you know, what is offensive? The subject matter is offensive. You know, um, and and so when one artist is censored, when one artist is subjected to to uh, to boycotts and overwrought complaints, you know, when that happens, other artists are chilled, and not just the ones who are thinking to themselves, "Oh, I was going to do a story about a Pakistani being lynched." You know, it's not that literal. The other artists who are chilled, who might engage in self-censorship in order to avoid pissing people off, are artists who think to themselves, in the case of Chaykin, well, what was his problem? You know, was it the depiction of nudity and violence? Maybe I shouldn't do that, even if it's right for the work they're doing. Maybe they'll pull back a little on that. You know, maybe it's the depiction of a hate crime. Should I do that hate crime story I was thinking of? Maybe not. Maybe I'll do another story. You know, was it that it simply wasn't done as well as Strange Fruit? Should I only do my hate crime story when I know that I can write something so beautiful and nuanced that nobody can complain about it? But until then, I might as well write something else. You know, um, and and then and again, it's not even as specific as the hate crime thing. It's hate crimes, it's violence, it's nudity, it's the mix of those things. It's racism. It's all these topics and more. And the artist starts thinking, the writer, the painter, the musician, should I do this, or am I risking my career or livelihood, or by attempting something like this? Should I just do a cute little story, like that, but the truth is that a lot of us who write horror have a hard time writing cute little stories. And would you really want a society in which artists make sure to offend no one? Going back to Strange Fruit, if we had that society in which artists make sure to offend no one, we wouldn't have Strange Fruit. Believe me, that was not a popular song in the South. It was a brave stance both by the songwriter and the singer to release that song. And especially at the time that they did. But had the censorious impulse been strong enough, maybe they wouldn't have gotten a distribution deal. Maybe that artist would have been told no. Maybe that singer would have been told no. Maybe the songwriter would have written the song, but then put it away. It's happened before. So that is my long rant on censorship. Let me end by saying, fuck censorship. And if you're still feeling censorious, please reconsider. The price you pay for good art is bad art. Artists need to be able to be free to create, and that means sometimes they'll create stuff that is terrible, that is shitty, that is in bad taste, that is offensive. Sometimes they'll do it. But when you chill one artist, when you go after one artist, it chills so many others. And that is my rant. All right, so let us look at this story here. It's called Untitled. Yeah, I'm gonna be doing a lot of talking today. And it's untitled. It's untitled because I've been giving more thought to my problems with Lissel the Gorgon, and I had decided a lot of things about the character, but I didn't really know why I decided those things. Like, for example, she's vulnerable to these dark star cultists. Even though she doesn't want to be part of the cult, she still feels a certain draw toward them. And I'm like, why is that? What about her makes her vulnerable? So I decided that I had to write backstory. And so the backstory I'm going to write, I'm not sure if I'm going to show you some of the backstory in a moment, but she's in her like late 20s, mid to late 20s when when she's tricked by the cult and taken by their god. Okay. We've already seen Lissel in Burlap Daughter. So what about Lissel before Burlap Daughter? She was around 16 for the important part of it. What about when she was younger? And what about 16 to around 25 or 26? What happened to her? That makes her still in her mid-20s vulnerable to being manipulated like this. And at the same time, why was she such a source of strength for Zella and Burlap Daughter? So when I wrote Burlap Daughter, I didn't have to answer these questions about Zella because I was writing them. I was writing, hey, this is what happened to Zella when she was young. This is what happened as she was older. And it was a very focused story, focusing on her mistreatment. But this story with Lissel is different. She has tormentors. She has, she has been raped by a god, and she was she was tricked into being this sacrifice. So this is not just, as in Burlap Daughter, one mother abusing one daughter. This is somebody, Lissel is somebody who's been hurt by life, and the same pain that she feels allows her to empathize with Zella, allows her to essentially be like a best friend and like a hero for Zella, to be honest. That's how I see her. Zella does what she does on her own, but it helps her to have Lissel there. Lissel's a great support for her. But Lissel is still hurt, and the places where she's hurt makes her vulnerable. And then the god hurts her again. So there's complexities here. Zella's story was, in terms of complexity, like one step above a fairy tale. I'm not saying it was bad. I love Burlap Daughter. It could be the best thing I've written. But Lissel's story is messier. Okay, so I thought, why don't I start writing Lissel's story from the beginning? As Dennis Miller once said, from DNA until this afternoon. So I'm going back to the beginning. Even before she was born, and I don't know how much I'm going to try to write like this Lissel series. And I'll have different viewpoint characters. In the first story, we're going to see her parents, as the viewpoint characters. And then we'll just keep on going from there. So let's see. So this first story, my genre really is magical realism. That is, people treat the supernatural as a matter of fact thing. So that, and this first story is going to be a short story. They're all going to be short stories, though. I don't know, probably. Anyways, it's a drama. I think I tend towards the minimalist in my writing, but I'm not too sure about that. Definitely those stories will be dramatic. The big plot is domestic. That's called the arch plot. The family just wants a house. Lissel's parents just want a house. In this new post-God era. But what they really want now, what they really want is stability. And the mini plot, that is, the stuff going on the inside. The arch plot is the stuff going on the outside. Work hard for a living in order to get a house. That's the external object of desire. That matches the arch plot. But the internal object of desire is stability. Society has been upended, and the family desires a house because it's representative of stability. By the way, it's not just representative of stability, it is stability, in a lot of ways. But this is going to be tragic also. And you'll see why. So here's the opening paragraph of this story about Lissel's parents. A little over 3 months before the world was torn apart by the arrival of alien space gods and other madness, Paul and Misha, recently married, just out of college. Oh, look at me, typing just married twice. Settling into their first apartment, discovered that Misha was pregnant. They kept the news secret until 3 months had passed. It was welcome news to their parents, friends, and family, especially since it came in summer, mid-August in Coral Springs, a suburb of Fort Lauderdale. At that point, no one could pretend that the weather was pleasant. It seemed like a hellish mix of asphalt, humidity, and heat, and so the arrival of a new child was a pleasant distraction, for there was a shower to plan, baby clothes to buy, advice to give to the young couple, and especially the young mother, who was doted upon and cooed over. Relatives who had not been pleased by the hasty marriage warned the new couple. Misha's aunt and uncle visited one night, and after they had left their apartment and Paul was nearly done washing the dishes, he said, "Now they think I might not be so terrible." Misha laughed and kissed him on the neck. Man, doing the dishes makes me horny," she said, squeezing his butt. Paul put the last dish away, just in time to follow Misha to the bedroom, and the new bed that her parents had just delivered that same morning. Paul was gentle and tentative in his lovemaking, so a few minutes in, Misha stopped for a moment. "Jesus, Paul, is it the bed, me, or the baby? None of us are made of glass, big guy. Sorry, honey." Sure. Now fuck me like I'm a noob in that video game you like." Paul laughed and forgot his caution, and they fucked, and in their sweaty, messy afterglow, they saw the night sky light up, as bright as the day, a roll of thunder that would not stop. And so went on for days, all over the world. There was no escaping it. Okay. So there you go. I know, very short. But I'm gonna write more about this. Yeah. So here I wanted to establish that Paul and Misha are a young couple in love. If you knew them on Facebook, you'd throw them a whole bunch of likes because they're always posting cute stuff. Misha has a good sense of humor. Paul is feeling a little bit of pressure, a little bit of I don't know, like a little lack of respect, and that's watch for that to build in the story. She's the one who got pregnant. She's the one who's got to, she's the one who's going to do most of the child rearing. Not all the time, I know. But this is what's going on in the story. And what's Paul going to do? Well, he's going to have to work. And how the hell are they going to do all this stuff when this happens? The night sky lights up. There's that roll of thunder that wouldn't stop. The gods are come. That is what happened. So that's going to mess with their plans. And as it messes with their plans and messes with their life, that's going to be reflected in Lissel, who's a good kid, but it's not easy growing up in turbulent times. This is going to be for the world as traumatic as the Great Depression was, and people who grew up during the Great Depression, were often scarred their entire lives by that experience. So that's about it for today. Thank you for listening to my rant, and I will talk to you later.